Welcome back to Burning Platforms, our regular look at the politics of technology brought to you by Capita's Centre of the Public Square. I'm Peter Lewis. This week we dive into the existential risks of AI with Good Ancestors CEO Greg Sadler. But first, our wrap of the news of the summer with regular panellists, Digital Rights Watch Chair Lizzie O'Shea and Health Engine CEO Dan Stinton. So welcome back to the first Burning Platforms of 2026. It's towards the end of January and nothing much has been going on as we've been lying around taking in the sun and reading all the books we promised to read last year in our final episode. And I will be checking in on your reading. It's not a book club, but, you know, there were best intentions there. But welcome back to our regular panellists. Lizzie O'Shea, Chair of Digital Rights Watch. Happy New Year, Lizzie, and welcome back.
Happy New Year. It does feel like a bit like the book police, but that's fine. We'll get to that in a minute.
That's okay. I just want to show off that I did do what I said I was going to do, which was a good experience, actually. And Dan, welcome back. I know you've been traveling the world and working hard, but I'm sure you've been doing your reading as well.
Yes, not the books that I said I was going to read at the end of last year either. A much more boring book I read over summer or reread over summer. But
we'll talk about that in a sec.
Talk about it.
Oh, we might. And our special guest for our first show back is the CEO of Good Ancestors, which is a not-for-profit looking at AI safety and long-term existential risk. Greg Sadler, joining us from Canberra. Look, welcome to Burning Platforms, Greg. And it's great to have you along for the evening.
Yeah, thanks for having me on, Peter. Appreciate it.
So before we get into the news, what did you read, Lizzie? And what was summer like?
So I didn't end up reading Intuitification, actually. That'll get us an explicit content warning. What I did end up reading was some fiction, a few things that I got as gifts, so it felt like a indulgence that I could afford myself. One thing I would just point out to people, though, is I read I haven't quite finished, I've almost finished a book by a guy called M.T. Anderson called Feed. I don't know if you guys have ever heard of this book, but it's like a dystopian future, shall we say, which was written a number of years ago, like at least 20 years ago, I think possibly more. But anyway, it's actually sort of anticipates a lot of things that we experience now in terms of social media and the like, which is quite uncanny to read. So I have really been enjoying reading that book, even though science fiction isn't always my most favorite genre. It is, I have a lot of time for people who kind of correctly predict the future. So I would recommend that to anybody who's thinking about the current problems we're facing with social media and algorithmic feeds shaping how we think about the world. It's very prescient and worth your time. It's not a very difficult book to read or anything. It's quite short. So
short is good. But also your last recommendation to me on science fiction, I've totally embraced over summer, so I'll definitely follow up with Feed. But I've loved getting my head into the world of Ursula Le Guin, and Santa was very kind to me. I got the short little novella, The Word for World is Forest, which is an amazing retelling of Vietnam, and The Left Hand of Darkness, which is almost like a dystopian Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, and now I'm deep into the deep sea, the Earthsea books, which is 6 books. I've just got the 4th, which was written like 30 years after the 3rd, and it's just incredible journey, but also a way of looking at our not just the future, but our world around human relationships rather than around battles and guns and all the things that Donald Trump's talking about at Davos. So it's been a great, fun sort of reset of my brain. I don't know.
Listen to how smuggy sounds, having gotten through half a dozen books in 2 weeks. Is that what the count is from that?
I've done 6 Ursula. I also did Humankind by Bregman.
He's undercooking it. My God.
Yeah, no, I've just been basically I've been on the beach. I know I've been on the beach reading basically, and couldn't be happier. So Dan, what did you read? A business book, I hear. You're such a well-rounded individual.
I feel like I'm giving you way too much ammunition way too early in the year, but yeah, I worked through for most of it in my defence, but I also I read an amazing strategy book. Well, I reread it. I read it years ago. I reread it called Seven Powers, The Foundations of Business Strategy, which I suspect no one here will read, but I think it's the best strategy book.
Is it mystical? Is there anything,
There's nothing mystical about it. It is very practically applicable, though, and I thought it was great. I would highly. I honestly think it's the best strategy book I've read. But anyway,
Are you using the techniques now? Are the techniques in the room with us at the minute?
Not with you, but I'm intending to use some of them. But there is one more thing I read, which was on brand, though, which I forwarded to both of you, and that was Dwarkesh Patel's Capital in the 22nd Century essay, which got a huge amount of attention over summer. I read that and enjoyed it, even if I disagree with him on some things. So that's worth everyone's time, actually, reading.
Yeah, and that's almost a segue into sort of Greg's work as well, in that sort of the trying to think through the longer term implications of the economic models around AI, and he does paint a pretty dystopian picture of what the work you're pursuing, Dan's, going to do for equality.
Yeah, some people working in tech. That's right, Peter. Not necessarily me, but yes, go. We'll move.
Just
on.
The bad ones. Before we go into it, what did you read over summer, Greg? Just out of interest, do you sort of get totally off your day job and go into different places, or are you just trying to get your head around all the great tech writing that's coming out at a rate of knots?
I mean, like, regularly is kind of the reverse. I've been sort of flat out over summer. So public servants love to release their consultations in December and then like ask for the results back in kind of like late January or early February. So that they get to have their summer holidays on the beach, but us poor not-for-profits are scrambling, trying to respond to all the questions that they've asked. So yeah, so we did a big research project over summer where we surveyed 140 professionals, like including Australians from top AI labs, about their views on this idea of a new AI safety institute in Australia. And I guess like the gist of that finding was that people are pretty excited about the idea of this new AI safety institute, and they sort of support this dual mission where it's going to like do frontier AI safety science at the same time as like helping policymakers understand AI. But yeah, there was some concerns about like culture and leadership and funding. But yeah, like in a nutshell, the outcome of that research was cautious optimism, I guess. So not a summer of reading, although I got through some trashy sci-fi, but a summer of research.
Nice. Well, we'll talk a bit more about your work in the second half of the show, but let's kick off with what happened over the summer. Lizzie, while many of us were dusting off our swimmers for the summer, Grok was taking it to a whole new level. What went on? What's happening? What does it mean?
I didn't need that intro, but anyway,
it was there. It had to.
So unless you've been living under a rock, you've been seeing what's going on with Grok. Yeah. Oh my gosh. Okay. Wow. Maybe we did
the whole thing in prose. Yeah. Couplets.
So there's just been this horrible trend in respective, particularly directed at women, about undressing them using Grok and creating images of women. And there's many women who've been affected by this, but there's it's telling that it's a parent of one of Elon Musk's children, the mother of one of his children, in fact, was getting targeted as well. But at one point it became this trend of users responding to women's comments by saying, put her in a bikini, and then generating an AI image of that woman, eventually becoming more and more explicit. By early January, as many as 6,000 tweets of this nature on X were being put forward to create these kinds of images prompts to Grok. And of course, what happens with Grok is it learns from content that is generated by it as well. So that's incorporated into the model. So you can see how potentially very damaging this is, not just for women being able to participate in online spaces, but also future image generation and the like, using these kinds of models. What I think it did highlight is there's a diverse range of responses. Like, what do you do about this? Because notice and takedown provisions clearly aren't suitable for this kind of mass creation of awful invasive content. Quite a bit of illegal content. So the generation of child sex abuse material, requests to undress women and children, but also then to put them in situations of violence, to add things like blood, just awful stuff. So quite threatening as well. Illegal imagery also being produced, and very little for the regulators to do about that, especially with the notice and takedown power. And you really realize that the way you provide safety in these spaces is not going to be through that kind of approach to content moderation, but instead through structural interventions.
So how does it work? Is it like a Notify app that's embedded into the AI, or is it?
Well, I mean,
like,
this is the question: aren't all image generation? Isn't all image generation software potentially notification software? This is the question, right? So there's a whole world in which you might wish to ban notification apps that explicitly do this and aim to do it. But there's a question around how these generalized models or foundation models, when it comes to image generation, say, could do the same task. And I think it becomes much more difficult. It's then a question of whether the custodian of that model wants to put in place guardrails, and whether those are actually effective is the next question. But I think we were talking about this, and it does this particularly egregious example and the kind of supercilious, horrible way that the owner of the platform responded. Elon Musk was at first ignoring it and joining in, including posting an image of himself in a bikini. Oh, this is all a great laugh. And then eventually clocked that this wasn't going to wash and he was causing a lot of trouble and started to do something about it. But you realize that you've got to have this faith in this small section of leadership of these companies that control these very powerful models, because this could potentially occur in other contexts. As we've discussed many times on this platform, the Sora application, the image generation software for film, for movies by OpenAI, they're pivoting towards creating adult content. And I don't know how they're going to maintain any kind of promise that this will be done consensually, or what is the process if it isn't done consensually. All these kinds of questions remain unanswered. And you can see the potential danger that is created by relying on these platforms to manage this stuff themselves, to impose guardrails. Whether there are effective guardrails or how you build them is another kind of technical question that will probably involve collaboration and research and organisation across the entire industry, if there was an intent to do it well and query that, right? And then how do regulators step in and do something about it? It's a really challenging problem, and our approaches to online safety, at least here, have not focused as much on structural interventions. I think we're going to have to think much more about how we do that. And we do have some. We'll talk about safety standards and the like for AI later on in the program, but we don't have all these hard enforceable ways in which we can challenge these platforms and stop them doing this kind of very egregious bad behavior.
Dan, we've asked the question before on image generation, where are the positive use cases? Again, it doesn't seem like this. The reason this is no longer being available on Grok is the public outrage rather than any form of regulation, right? What's your take on it?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are positive use cases for image generation, but I can't see any positive use case for a deepfake. I can't understand. Like, Sora as a concept to me was just at a foundational level, just a bad idea, because it's normalizing the idea of taking somebody's likeness and creating a new image or a new video of them. And if that is the norm that we create, this kind of thing is just going to become ever more common, right? So I mentioned this on, I can't remember which show it was, but one of our shows towards the end of last
probably
year.
All of them, yeah.
Probably all of them. Well, you look at David Pocock's suggested bill, the online safety bill or whatever it was that he is suggested towards the end of last year. I think it was in November of last year. And that would prohibit non-consensual AI-generated deepfake content, right? That is the point of it. Like, not just this kind of sexually explicit content or Notify content, but content without a consumer's consent or another person's consent. And it should only be with the express consent of a person that this kind of, not this kind of thing, but any kind of use of someone's likeness is allowed. Because obviously this just shows the worst of it, right? I mean, and it's only going to get worse, as you've touched on, Lizzie, when, we're starting to go even further into pornographic territory, right? Which is going to become even worse. And it's probably already happening on dark corners of the internet that probably are getting less attention. I mean, the thing about this one is it got a lot of attention because there's a lot of people that use X, but I'm sure this kind of thing is going on a lot more underground, right? And it's not getting the attention that it probably deserves. So I just think that's got to be, it's not a foolproof remedy, clearly, because people are going to do bad things, but surely this norm has to be established that you cannot create a deep fake of anybody ever. And if that becomes the norm, then this kind of thing at least would become less common, I would have thought.
Mm.
I don't know if I'm kidding myself with that, but it seemed like a pretty sensible law that I think most reasonable people would agree with.
Mm. How did you look at the Grok saga playing out over summer, Greg?
Yeah, I mean, I think the points that Lizzie makes are sort of spot on. But like she mentioned the child sexual abuse material and images, like presumably that like a serious crime could have occurred there. Like if an Australian business had facilitated the creation of potentially millions of CSAM images, like you would expect a knock on the door from the AFP, and rightly so. That's what the Australian community would expect. And like presumably the AFP hasn't reached out to XAI about this. There is a point to tease apart between like X Twitter and what XAI and Grok have done here. So Twitter is like sharing and making this available and drawing attention, but like this is a capability that XAI has built into Grok, a dangerous capability, something that we don't want to be available to the public. And like, I guess maybe there's some sort of e-safety rules that are talking about, you know, Twitter's sharing of this, but this underlying question, like why are we building AI models that can produce CSAM? Like, I think this is a more fundamental question. And like there's a lot of things that sit into that bucket of a dangerous capability that we could train an AI model or like are currently training AI models to do. And I'll talk a little bit about, if we get to it, about AIs that can help build bioweapons. And it's just crazy that we're just like making available AI models that have these dangerous capabilities.
So on that point of the Grok AI, Greg, like does that mean that they're at the moment I go and build myself a large language model? There's nothing stopping me incorporating anything into it, is there?
Yeah, I mean, I think the point was made that they're trying to build general models that can do as many things generally as possible, and you know, harmful things and productive things all fall into this bucket of generality. So yeah, like the intention is to make models that have as many capabilities as possible.
Well, I mean, copyright exists, right? Like, so yeah, you're right in terms of the intent, but like legally, what exists to stop you doing that? Like, there are things like copyright, but we know, for example, Human Rights Watch has found that some of the image generation platforms have been trained on child sex abuse material because the data that they collect to put into the system for training is they use broad methods of collecting that. They use crawlers and bots, whatever, to collect it from all corners of the web. So they're completely indiscriminate about what goes into the training set. And, you know, there's this story that Karen Howe covers in her history of OpenAI about how for image generation, there was a question about whether they should include explicit material, pornographic material, adult content. And without it, the image generation just didn't work for women's faces, so they put it back in. But what it means then is the basis, the training set for creation of particularly women's representation in these systems tends to come from a particular, you know, it's very heavily dependent on particular sources of explicit and adult content. And, you know, is that acceptable? Like, these general purpose models are trained on everything, can do everything. So there's this question around whether they can ever be safe, right? And this, I think, has highlighted how difficult it is. Like, there are guardrails you can put in place, but you do also rely on governance structures to do that. There's lots of different decision making that's involved in that, and then query whether those guardrails can be circumvented.
And the other story that caught my eye over the summer, which is kind of not as extreme, but in a way is as extreme, was the story of the bush legend on TikTok, which is an AI generated Indigenous guy talking about bush tucker. Now, again, totally constructed, no labeling of it being falsely generated, and seemingly no guardrails. It was only because it was picked up that there's been any sort of issue around that, right?
Yeah, I mean, this is also something that lots of Indigenous communities, custodians of different kinds of cultural knowledge from First Nations communities have been raising for a while. Like, how you are a custodian of knowledge, it does come into conflict with a lot of the way in which these tools, platforms, whatever, have been developed. They expropriate and then transform. They are not custodians themselves. They're not at all thoughtful or careful. And I think, you know, this is something that was immediately obvious to many people who come from First Nations backgrounds. And I'm not surprised then that we've started to see how this is playing out as more and more people start to use and exploit the model.
Yeah. Let's move on to a different release of AI technology over the summer. Dan, you're looking at ChatGPT Health that's sort of been unleashed by OpenAI over the summer, and I guess the positive and also the not so positive use cases that seem to be emerging pretty quickly from it.
Yeah, so ChatGPT Health, I think it was announced just towards the end of last year, and it's basically designed to help people ask health and wellness questions, and specifically to connect their own health data, so medical records and wellness apps and those sort of things, to get more personalised responses. Now, according to OpenAI, the reason they've done this is that 5% of the ChatGPT prompts are related to healthcare, so that's 40 million people a day that are putting in prompts into ChatGPT and asking for health advice and what have you. So what they've done, I guess, is created a new product out of this, and it's a dedicated space for health chats, which are separate from the general conversations. I guess on the plus side, it's you've got the option to upload your medical records and connect your wellness apps, as I've mentioned, and they claim to have enhanced privacy protection. So it's encrypted, it's isolated from the rest of the models, it's not used to train.
Yeah, saying not being used to train it. Yeah.
Yeah. And they claim it's designed to support and not replace doctors, which I'll come back to because I think that's a big question. Now, they also say that they collaborated with hundreds of physicians globally to help them shape and review the system. And it's been rolling out, I think only in the US, it's waitlist functionality only. In Australia, at least I'm on the waitlist, and that's all I've been able to get access to so far. And it's also worth noting that this came, a few days later. Anthropic unveiled Claude for healthcare, which is a very similar product, which they're also spruiking. And it also comes with Google perhaps going in the other direction. They removed some AI health summaries following a Guardian investigation that took place over summer that were basically creating some inaccurate information and putting people's health at risk. So it's interesting to see the different directions that the models are going in, or at least the major ones. So look, as ever, I've got pretty mixed feelings about this, but on the whole, I'm more concerned than optimistic. I'll talk through some of the positives first, and then I'll tell you why I think this is pretty risky. So I think it probably is an improvement on Dr. Google, and that is what most people are currently doing, right? Is they're basically going in and putting something into Google and then surfing the web to try and find an answer. And the sources that they're relying on for that are often pretty poor.
Tends to be health marketing from my interactions with Dr. Google.
Maybe I'm pushing you too far into the negatives. Why do you say that?
Well, I guess I'm assuming, and perhaps incorrectly, it's a fair question, probably, Lizzie, perhaps incorrectly, I'm assuming that because they've used physicians to do this, they've trained this on more reliable data sources than just the entire internet. But I could be wrong on that. I don't know. So we'll never know. That's one of the problems, right?
Yes, exactly.
The other thing that I think is a positive, though, before I get to the negatives, is it's your ability to load in data from wearables. So Whoops and Apple watches and the like. That has real potential, by the way, because at the moment, most GPs, not all I should stress, but most GPs aren't doing much with that data, and it is really valuable data. And so, being able to do that constantly in real time, that could produce some really good health outcomes for patients. And I guess, the other thing is patients genuinely being pretty informed when they go and speak to their doctor, and I guess getting a pretty convenient second opinion. Might not be the right opinion, which I'll come back to, but getting a pretty convenient second opinion, that could have some utility, I think. But here's why I'm concerned, and why I'm more concerned than optimistic about it, right? So number one, obviously, whatever you put into this is going to have pretty limited context, and nowhere near as much context as most people's GP, right? So it's going to be making judgments on things with a really limited information that could be completely wrong. And it can also hallucinate, right? So that is happening less and less with these models. That everything I'm reading suggests that. That's certainly been my experience in using them every day. But what's interesting, we touched on this in the previous story, right? So the ability for these large language models to hallucinate seems, or definitely goes up with the wider application of the model and the more you're asking it to do. So, I've got some experience in this. We've developed an AI receptionist at Health Engine, We have trained that very deliberately on very limited data sets. And because of that, we have very high confidence that it doesn't hallucinate. But as soon as you start putting in more data sets into it, your ability to control that goes out the window. I should also stress we've made the very deliberate decision not to do anything clinical because we still don't think that the technology is there. And that's not the situation with others. But so, you know, OpenAI, it's got the largest data set possible, right? It's trained on the entire internet. So I think its ability to hallucinate and get things wrong is going to be high enough to be dangerous. And then lastly, I gather this is going to operate outside of the Therapeutic Goods Administration in Australia. And so, you know, because of that, I'm pretty sure that OpenAI are going to argue that this is, you know, for educational purposes only or for general information only.
Well, that's their spin, but yeah, it's to calm everyone down, but that doesn't mean that's the long-term play.
No, and it doesn't mean that that's what consumers are going to feel about it, right? So, and this is I guess the biggest problem I've got is that most consumers, when they use this enough, are going to start to trust it and potentially start to trust it more than their regular GP. And that is a recipe for disaster in my mind, because it's not good enough. It's just not good enough. And I'm not sure it's ever going to be good enough. And so if, you know, in the US where there's like millions of people that don't have health insurance and going to the doctor is prohibitively expensive, maybe that's a net benefit. But in Australia, where we've got one of the best healthcare systems in the world, this is not something we need, not something we need at all.
That's a really interesting point, you know, that it's another example of something being developed in America for an American need that may not be needed here to the same extent, right?
Yeah, and Europe would feel the same way, right? So I think this is a classic case of something being rolled out for the US, which may be a net positive for the US, but is going to be a net negative for the rest of the world. So let's see.
And poor people being processed by machines and rich people affording the capacity to be seen and managed by humans.
What's your take, Lizzie? I know Digital Rights Watch is sort of moving into this space, specifically around the way GPs use AI tools, but tell us a bit about that, but also your take on the launch of ChatGPT Health.
Yeah, we're looking at the moment at the role of AI scribes who, you know, there's many of them in Australia now providing, particularly into GP services, to do automatic transcription. So they record the appointment, they don't keep the recording most of the time, and they just provide a summary of what was discussed. And I think there's a variety of different problems. We're doing some research into it. But I also think a lot of the time the conversation is between the professional provider and the service provider, you know, the tech service provider. And it isn't often the case that patients are taken into account perhaps in the way that they ought to in how this tech is developed or rolled out. So I think that's an interesting phenomenon to observe. I think there are ways in which you have to then shape how you present to conform with a machine that's processing you, right? So, you know, how you describe symptoms and stuff will have to become legible to a machine. So there's all these like kind of moral philosophy problems with it, as well as quite practical ones about what do you do if your understanding of what occurred was different to the transcription? Where does the liability lie? You know, and how do these whether these products also stray into diagnostic, because that is, of course, when it would come under the purview of the TGA and have to be regulated medical device. And I think the TGA is in the process of considering what to do about some of these scribes, because they're planning, I think, I would imagine a lot of them are planning to move into the space of diagnostics, using scribes as the entry point. And I do think that anything that looks like diagnostics should be under serious consideration by the TGA. This is portrayed as ChatGPT Health. It's not said, oh, you know, this is a place to store your health data or sensitive data or whatever. It's like, this is an everything chatbot for health. So I don't know how they can necessarily escape the idea that they're doing diagnostic work that would bring them under the purview of the TGA as a medical device that would need to be approved, right? Because otherwise there's all sorts of implications in using unapproved medical devices. So I think they're really in a difficult spot. And at the very least, it's potentially misleading to claim that you're offering a health service when you're not. And it's very difficult, I think, to put in guardrails that are totally foolproof, that are impossible to evade. There's been plenty of stories about this, but, you know, there's a terrible story about a kid who was looking up dosing requirements or dosing suggestions for drug taking and using all sorts of ways in the chat log you can see to circumvent some of the guardrails that have been put in there to stop people doing that, including amending your language. So it's a very wicked problem, working out how to set effective guardrails where you're just giving friendly advice, not medical advice. Like, I just don't think that's a realistic distinction that they can promise on the technology. So I think it's a very dangerous space, and I think it's hugely problematic. Eventually, it might be something that is pitched or marketed as a tool for doctors, and I think that is also problematic. But at least then you can see how it would be something that is clearly in need of regulation, of potentially evolving our system of analysing its strengths and weaknesses, or how you would kind of collude or collaborate to develop the most effective guardrails possible, build in friction and UX kind of capabilities that stop it being used in ways that it shouldn't. But like, this is not how it's evolving, right? Quite the
No,
opposite.
and one of the points made in a lot of the commentary has been how little research has been done into the models ahead of their release into the public domain. And I don't know your take on this, Greg, but it feels like, health has been put forward as one of the positive use cases of AI, but often with the vibe of it solving problems rather than the specific benefits being put forward.
Yeah, I think, Lizzie was just explaining why this is putting like OpenAI or in a difficult situation. I also think it's putting sort of government in a tricky situation here, where they're kind of saying, oh, no, existing regulators have AI risks under control. Like we don't need to have like specific guardrails for general purpose AI systems. But then you have the general purpose AI provider being like, oh, no, the specific rules don't apply to us because we're actually this general tool. And this is coming into this conversation about like, is there a gap analysis? So I mean, this isn't my area of law, but like the Therapeutic Goods Act has this like technologically neutral definition, and it says like if it's being presented as being for a therapeutic use, including preventing diseases or doing diagnostics, then it becomes a therapeutic good. And as Dan was saying, like we know that this is a very popular and specific use case that the companies are well aware that people are using. Like if you go to use these general purpose products, they don't say like, oh no, sorry, we're not a therapeutic tool. Like, no, they're very happy to help you with your diagnostics. So like I just don't see how, like I don't think it's credible for them to argue that they're not regulated by the Therapeutic Goods
Yeah,
Act.
to be clear, in order to be a therapeutic good or fall under that umbrella, it has to be software, and it has to be intended to diagnose, screen, predict, monitor, guide, treatment, or influence clinical decisions. Surely this is doing that.
It's doing it. They're just saying it's not. The other thing that gets me, and I know we've got to move on, Dan, is that, the huge backlash when it was found out that my health record and people were going to, like, the pushback on sharing your health details, probably 5 or 6 years ago now, particularly when it became public that there was deals to look at ways of commercializing the data. Like, it just did not land. Whereas it feels like with this one, people are so conditioned to sort of having their Fitbit and everything on that I feel like the public's become less skeptical of sharing their data with technology. And
well, it is surprising though, isn't it, that there's people are more trusting of a totally profit motivated company based in the US, which is not subject to Australian regulation or barely, versus the democratically elected government of Australia. I mean, as flawed as some of those solutions were, at least there was some Australian control over what was being proposed there, right? So it's hard to fathom, to be honest.
Yeah. Hey, we better move on. I just wanted to quickly do my bit of good news for the summer, which was the announcement from Bandcamp that it was basically going to have generative AI as an unwelcome guest on their platform. So Bandcamp's probably the go-to platform for most people who care about music. Its model's different to Spotify. It really privileges artists and albums and curating music by humans rather than just having algorithmic streams. It prides itself on sending over 80% of its revenue back to the artist. And I know people that I know who work in music say that's where the good stuff's happening. But they announced over summer that they would ban from its platform music and audio that is generated wholly or in a substantial way by AI, and also tools specifically that impersonate other artists or styles. And where I think this is interesting, we know that Spotify is now being taken over AI slop and that sort of very unvirtuous cycle of AI algorithms serving up AI generated music. But it does signpost that there are other tech businesses are looking for ways of offering consumers alternatives. And while I'm always skeptical at putting the onus from the system onto the citizen, I think this is a really good choice. I know I've shut down my Spotify account and I've shifted across to Bandcamp, and it's a really good user experience. I don't know if you've used it, Dan. I know you love your music, but
I love Bandcamp. I absolutely love it. And this was going to be my story if you hadn't picked up on it, Peter. But I probably banged on about this issue enough, so I thought better of it. But yeah, I think this is such a welcome development. And by the way, separate to the AI thing, what's great about Bandcamp, by the way, is they found a way to almost make music feel like it did before streaming. Like what I'm noticing is as I buy more and more music on Bandcamp, you end up going back to your albums that you have bought more and more, and it's a lot like the world that we were in before streaming came along. And
you listen to an album 5 times before it earworms you, and then you really appreciate it rather than just getting song after song. Yeah, I love it.
So I love this.
Yeah, good. Lizzie, it was also interesting over summer, the chief scientist, Alan Finkel, announced his new initiative. I think it's called Wholly Human. I haven't got the notes in front of me, which is all about labeling human-generated content, which I think is also an interesting initiative. I think there's a number of things that will play out this year, including, I suspect, the tech industry is going to be back pushing for data mining that has been greenlit in the UK. I don't know if that battle's over, but also some sort of labelling regime so consumers can make its choice. So how are you watching this one play out?
Yeah, well, if they do try to come for that data mining exemption again, I think, we have a bit of muscle memory there, so we'll hopefully get on and start campaigning around that. I mean, can I just say on the last discussion, I've never used a music streaming platform, so maybe I need to use Bandcamp. It's going to be 100%. My first.
It's not a streaming service. It's better than that, and it's also all the music that you discover there is curated by humans. So that's the other.
There's nice choral music there too.
I love choral music. Former chorister myself. Yeah,
I know you are. You a Bandcamp user, Greg? Any thoughts on this one?
Well, I'm with Lizzie. I've also never used a music streaming service, which is maybe unusual.
Half of the population in the room. I love it.
But I guess there is something in common between both the music story, like I guess the fact that AI songs are rising in the charts, and also the need to build technology that can label human and non-human work, is that there's just more and more domains where AI capability is meeting or exceeding human capability in those domains. Like this is something that coders are feeling acutely at the moment. I mean, there was even some AI companies like sort of people doing coding inside AI companies who are saying that now their AI model is doing 100% of the coding that they're using to build the next generation of the model. So I guess the point is that there's just more and more sort of skills or professions where AI can do what humans can do. And so like, I mean, a good ancestor, I'm thinking like, what's the future of this? Like, how many more capabilities can AI overtake humans in before we start ending up with like really widespread problems? And banning AI music from an app is a useful bit of first aid to perform in one domain. But what happens if this happens or as this happens in dozens or hundreds of domains?
Yeah, indeed. Let's talk a bit more about you now, though, Greg. Like, we'll move into the deep dive, and thank you again for joining us and contributing so far. So let's kick off with, who are good ancestors? What are you on about? And how did a mild-mannered public servant from Canberra get to be running an organisation looking at what's going to happen in 200 years' time?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. So I suppose the idea of good ancestors is that we want to help Australia's leaders to be good ancestors to future generations. So we're focused on issues where the actions that a policymaker can take today will have ramifications for many years to come, whether that's 5 years or 10 years or 100 years, but certainly beyond the current election cycle. So we've done work on pandemic prevention or mirror life and catastrophic disasters, so like nuclear war or space weather or food security, and like systemic reform issues. But yes, certainly since 2023, when like AI leaders came out and said like the risks of their technology of AI were comparable to pandemics or nuclear war, we've been increasingly focused on AI. And I guess that's because AI could be just a real gift that we give to future generations. Like it could go tremendously well, and like all of these benefits we were talking about for health or climate change or whatever else, this could all come true, and people will look back at us in 10 or 100,000 years from now and say like, those people really nailed that AI stuff. But that just doesn't feel like the track that we're on currently, right? Like AI has...
Gee, that Tim Ayres set things up for the next 200 years with his...
Yeah, I mean, it's just like these serious risks, and humanity as a whole just like isn't really grappling with these. So I mean, one thing I do, like whenever I want to talk about AI, sort of giving a presentation, I always start with a slide from the MIT AI risk repository. So this is like a taxonomy of all of the risks that they've found reported in the scientific literature about AI. So that covers like discrimination and privacy, or environmental issues, and like loss of human agency, like as you just sort of say, like we'll do what the AI says increasingly, or even these kind of like loss of control risks. And I mean, the reason I point to that is because like all of these ideas are like, they're well grounded in the scientific literature. Like if you're working on addressing those problems, like this is a very valid problem to be working on. And I guess like what I'm trying to do at Good Ancestors is to sort of skate to where the puck is going to be, right? So like if these events keep happening, what does it mean if we get this highly capable AI that the AI labs like say that they're working to? So I guess like to take an analogy on that, if the US and Russia said that they were, in a race to land on the moon, like maybe you could have sort of valid uncertainties about whether they're going to achieve that. But I think it would be embarrassing if you were kind of like a policymaker and a country landed on the moon and you were like, oh, this seems like a surprising outcome. So we're trying to say like, yeah, let's take it seriously that these AI companies are investing trillions of dollars in this race to sort of highly capable AI systems, like whatever you want to say, like artificial general intelligence or however you want to define it. But like, what are we going to do if that does happen? Like, what's humanity's role? And I mean, I guess the final thought is, I'm trying to cash that out in like really practical research. So like you could have a very philosophical conversation about 1,000 years from now, but like we are trying to put forward practical policy recommendations to policymakers today. So really any thinking, whether it's 5 or 1,000 years into the future, has like similar like tractability in the political environment. So I mean, we've been calling for an AI Safety Institute, and we were excited to see that in the AI plan because we think that's one thing that could make a difference here. And yeah, there's like other policy recommendations as well. So we talk a lot about AI and biosecurity. But yeah, I mean that's the overview of what we're up to.
Yeah, one of the I think interesting tensions between long-term risk and immediate risk is how you balance out the two and how you weight them. How do you think about that?
Yeah, so I mean, I think that on these AI risks, like we need to be walking and chewing gum at the same time, right? Like the people who are worried about today's risks of AI are like absolutely worried about real problems that we should be addressing. But I think there's also scientific evidence to support the fact that there's going to be problems next year and the year after that, and we should be trying to get ahead of those as well. So I mean, I suppose like there is this like philosophical idea about long-termism, but I mean, what matters for me is this kind of idea of intergenerational fairness, right? Like there's people who just like don't have a voice in our democracy because they're going to be born tomorrow or they're going to be born in 10 years from now, but they're going to live on the same land that we're living on now. And I think it's right to realize that those people don't have a voice in democracy and try and account for them. And like, I mean, maybe this sounds weird, but like everyone who's concerned about climate change is concerned about exactly this, right? Like the worst effects of climate change will be felt by, people who aren't born today. But I think we all kind of just have this intuitive sense that it's right to worry about climate change and it's right to make sure that people in 100 years or 1,000 years aren't inheriting a cooked planet. And I think that same logic applies to the risks of artificial intelligence.
Yeah, I mean, I must say though, of course, Greg, as you probably anticipate, I'm going to ask you about this, but it's got a pretty checkered reputation, especially in other parts of the world, the concepts of like long-termism or, effective altruism, which is often associated with long-termist thinking. Most of this is focused on the Future of Humanity Institute, which was at Oxford and was recently shut down because there's an association with these kinds of ideologies, which I'm not saying is necessarily yours, but certainly within the movement with some pretty unsavory ideologies, ideas about eugenics and stuff like that. That is some of the criticism that's been thrown around about some of this thinking. And then there's the, that kind of balancing question about what do you do? Like you can think about risks in the long term, or you can think about something like AGI, artificial general intelligence, but that's those are like there's a real possibility that AGI doesn't happen, right? And then you spend a lot of time thinking about a problem that hasn't eventuated, while problems in the here and now continuing to accelerate and make life miserable for people who do exist in here and now. It feels remiss to not at least raise some of these kind of controversies within the movement of thinkers. I mean, the other point that is commonly raised is that, of course, this is a kind of favoured ideology of some of the tech bros that we all love to despise, including someone like Elon Musk and the like, because they like to invest in this technology and are often big believers in the potential of AGI, and therefore sort of think that it's a risk that has to be managed or understand the logic and like that kind of logic that makes them seem cleverer than everybody else. Which again, I'm not saying is where you're coming from, but
what is your question here, Lizzie?
Well, I just want to give you the opportunity to respond to some of that.
Yeah.
How do you grapple with that in your own mind, or what do you say to people who raise those concerns with you?
Yeah, so I mean, there's a lot there. So I suppose there's some criticism of effective altruism, and there's obviously people in the movement who have done bad things, which obviously I don't support. I mean, this is common in many movements. I mean, there's people in the digital privacy movement who have done reprehensible things that we wouldn't support, and that doesn't, I don't think, detract from the importance of online privacy. The fact that some people in the community have done bad things, and yeah, I mean, that's absolutely the case in the world of effective altruism. I suppose, I mean, staying on the idea of effective altruism for a second, we have this idea of altruism, right? So we're trying to help other people, which I mean is just hopefully something that we can get behind. Like, Australia is remarkably not a very altruistic country, so we give about half as much to charity as Kiwis do, and I think we could all just serve to be more altruistic, both for the personal benefits we get from just caring about other people, but also like the broader society benefits. And I mean, this idea of effectiveness is maybe something that people can get stuck on. But if you imagine like government was running an aid program, like we want government to be spending money in that aid program in the way that it's going to go the furthest and, be supported by sort of evidence and evaluations. And I think it just makes sense when we think about donating money to charity that we're also thinking about, what's the evidence base for this? Like, where's the randomized control trial? So, like personally, I make my donations to distribute anti-malarial bed nets in sub-Saharan Africa. And to me, it's sort of morally maddening that there's someone dying today for want of a $2 bed net. And like, I mean, you're talking about eugenics or something, but I don't see any connection between wanting to make sure someone doesn't die for want of a $2 bed net and sort of like off the wall philosophy kind of ideas. But I mean, like bringing this back to AI, like I don't think we can call these risks speculative anymore. So like maybe 5 years ago, this sort of stuff sounded weird, but we've just seen AI like meeting and exceeding human capability in so many domains, now. Like, even the idea that AI can make a sort of a chart-topping song that we're seeing seems to be something that no one would have thought possible 5 years ago, but here we are. And like these sorts of risks, they're detailed in reports by the companies themselves. They're detailed in reports by AI safety institutes. They're detailed in the International AI Safety Report. So yeah, like absolutely harms exist on a continuum of what's happening now and what might happen in the future. But I guess like if we don't have sufficient evidence to act on these AI harms now, like I just like don't know what that threshold for sufficient evidence would be.
Hey Greg, can I get specific then? So I think was the only one, I know I was the only one of the regulars on this podcast that was in support of the new AI plan that was announced towards the end of last year. Mostly because it was more focused on dealing with the harms that existed in the here and now and less worried about the harms that may come up in the future. And I'm just deeply skeptical of the concept of AGI in general. I think these machines are going to become increasingly capable and be able to automate more things, and that's for the good. But I'm less and less worried. Not totally not worried, but I'm less and less worried about AGI sort of taking over the world with some misaligned system. So help me understand, don't give us everything that you're working on, because obviously that would be a long conversation, but what are the two or three major risks that you are most concerned about in the long run where you think there is some evidence of that happening?
Yeah, so I suppose I've flagged biosecurity risks a few times in this call. So why don't I double click on that idea of biosecurity risks? So I guess the idea here is it's the intersection of what's possible in biotechnology land and what's possible in AI land. So this first kind of got popularized in 2022 when a sort of a company that had a narrow AI model designed for drug discovery sort of asked it the inverse question and said, like, hey, can you try and come up with a novel toxin? And in less than 6 hours, that narrow AI model generated 40,000 novel toxins, including like reinventing VX nerve agent and perhaps coming up with some other, like some novel molecules that were even more toxic. So that was 2022. In 2023, Dario Amodei, the CEO of Anthropic, was telling, I think it was the US Senate, that he thought that in 2 or 3 years from now, that there was a substantial risk that AI tools would broaden the range of actors who could conduct a large-scale biological attack. And we saw in the sort of AI model cards, like where the AI companies themselves set out what they thought their models can do, this sort of boiling of the frog, where we went from like maybe one day AI models will be able to coach people through the process of building a bioweapon to our models can kind of do this, but not effectively, to our models are on the cusp of doing this. And then like just late last year, we started seeing the models saying like the AI lab saying our models actually have this capability now, but for the security requirements we've put on them, the ones which I think we know that are very easy to jailbreak. So sort of late last year, we with another Australian charity called Global Shield brought out a US organization called Civ AI to do closed door demonstrations of this risk with parliamentarians as well as with public servants. So in this demo, Civ AI, they take a frontier AI model, so they can do it with a range of different companies' models. They jailbreak it live. They run it on the AI company's own servers, and they instruct it to do things like set out a plan for sort of conducting a bioweapon attack. It talks through how you can find dangerous DNA sequences online, like how you can download them, how you can format them and send them off to a DNA printing company. It can give you advice on like which DNA printing companies aren't likely to do safety screening of your DNA. It can talk you through like how to rent a wet lab in Australia and like how to hire a part-time university student and like what tasks you can give them to help make the mail order DNA into a bioweapon. And like this just seems to be like a crazy level of capability that these AI models have, that like we can demonstrate live to MPs.
And how do the MPs respond? They still think there's more opportunity than risk.
Well, I mean, I think all of the MPs in that room were shocked and surprised and deeply curious about the fact that was a thing that was possible. And I mean, I guess there's like sort of a few outcomes here. So one of them is that like this was part of our advocacy for Australia to have an AI Safety Institute, because we just need to do the sort of AI science research necessary to understand how you stop a model from like disclosing these kinds of dangerous capabilities. But I guess there's also, like in this particular case, there's ways that you can address this specific gap, right? So this risk turns on this mail order DNA, right? Like, can you write to a company and say, can you send me in the post like a test tube full of the following DNA, and they won't do a safety screen on that. So currently Australia has something called the Biocon regime, which is a regulation exactly for screening this kind of DNA, and it would be within the power of the existing regulation to screen all of this synthetically imported DNA for dangerous sequences and to perform like background checks on the kind of people doing it. So this would be like a really practical move that the Australian government could take with sort of no economic downsides and like significant safety benefits. And there's a specific flag in the National AI Plan, like in that third chapter, the safety chapter, where they say, we've set up a task force to look into exactly doing this. So like I think that's like a really positive example, and like I hope to see government action on that this year. And it's the kind of thing where if Australia takes action and says like, yeah, we're going to safety screen all DNA imported into Australia, we think other countries should do this as well, that Australia could build the global movement that we've done in other areas like cigarette plain packaging towards a positive safety outcome.
So do you see that, Greg, that kind of regulation is happening not actually in relation to the tech, but into relation to other systems that are created that have vulnerabilities exposed within them as a result of the tech? Is that where you think some of the kind of low-hanging fruit lies, to mix the metaphor?
Yeah, no, so it has to be both. So like in this synthetic DNA case, like because there's such a clear bottleneck where like this one particular component is required to do the dangerous thing, in that case, I think the low-hanging fruit is great, like we can just close off this one problem and then we can address this risk. But that's not going to work for all of the risks of general purpose AI. So you also need to think about how we're going to make these models safe, either from a technical perspective, like can we invent the airbags and crumple zones of AI so that like these, that Grok isn't producing CSAM and publishing online. And also like how do you put in place like the guardrails to make sure that companies like actually deploy those airbags once they're available?
One of the risks that you identify in that report, I'd like you to talk a bit more about, is you call it open weight misuse, which I think is the most shocking risk of all. That it's basically saying, if we do all the work to build the guardrails and the safety features, it's the capability to get around the guardrails and safety features, because it feels to me that's the end of the game if that becomes a reality.
Yeah. So this is a really interesting topic, and it's a difficult topic. So I guess the idea of an open weight model, for people who haven't come across that, is like when you access ChatGPT, you're probably going through the website or maybe through an API, and you're playing with an AI model that is like within the hands of OpenAI. But these open weight models are they're sort of similar to open source software in that the parameters that power the model are made publicly available, and so you could run them on someone else's cloud, or conceivably you could run them on your own computer. So and this is really cool, right? So these open weight models have like so many benefits. Like they're good for researchers, they're good for AI safety science, they democratize AI. Like there's lots of things to be positive and excited about with open source or open weight AI. The downside is, and so there was some research that we talk about that came out in sort of mid last year, which was a sort of it was a toolkit that was used for removing the safeguards from these open weight models. So basically, you can imagine an open weight model comes out and it won't produce CSAM, or it won't give instructions to build biological weapons, but those guardrails can be like readily removed. And so the science showed that these models went from rejecting 95% of these kind of dangerous prompts to complying 95% of the time once there's sort of guardrails removed. So once these models are out there, they can easily have their safeguards removed, and then like all of the dangerous capabilities that we were protecting with these safeguards alone then become widely available. And so if like, like with this Grok example, right? Like if the lab is so inclined, like it can change the safeguards and make something that was dangerous safe again. But like once this model's out in the wild, like there's just nothing that you can do. So I mean, on that CSAM example, like if that version of Grok was open sourced and was just made available to everyone, like you can never put that genie back into the bottle. So yeah, that's what this open source misuse could be about. And like as the AI models become more capable and those safeguards are protecting more dangerous capabilities, like this misuse risk just gets worse.
So what do we do about open weight models then, Greg? Like this seems to be, if I've understood you correctly, that seems to be a bigger risk than these proprietary models, which are within a walled garden. But China's producing these at a rate of knots. Meta's strategy seems to be changing constantly, but they've obviously put a lot of these out into the world. I think having faith in a company like Meta putting a model out into the world with the safeguards to begin with is questionable. So let alone if those safeguards can then be removed. What's the answer here? What's the possible remedy?
Yeah, so it's absolutely a wicked problem that like there's so many benefits from these open weight models. Like we want them to flourish, but if they're dangerous, then that comes with its own downside. So I think that the only way forward on open weight specifically is that you need to do robust evaluations of the risks of a model. And if that model can do things like produce weapons constructions for bioweapon manufacture, that's the kind of model that should not be made open weight. Like unless you can come up with some safeguard that can't be so easily reverse engineered. So there is some interesting sort of research in this space about kind of like deleting parts of the neural net. So you can kind of find like what are the neurons associated with some particular capability. And so like rather than putting like a wrapper on it that says like, if you get asked to, make CSAM say no, instead go in and like delete the neurons that correspond with that dangerous capability, so that even if you remove that safeguard, it still wouldn't be able to do it. So yeah, there's new research required, but I think ultimately it's about let's like measure the dangerous capabilities of models, and just like not make things available that have dangerous capabilities.
I still end up thinking the risks are so great. Like it's like having a nuclear reactor in the backyard and everyone playing with it themselves. It's not like this is. I struggle to see a safe path forward with this technology. Like it's going to save some money. Like it's going to create some good businesses. But geez, there's long-term discussions to be had here.
Yeah. I mean, maybe the disagreement with Dan here is just like, what is the trajectory for the capability of these models? And like, if the trajectory does stop, like if AR models stop at about this point of capability, like, you know, maybe that's not so bad. But if this rate of progress of just like more and more domains being sort of sucked up by the general purpose models continues, then yeah, I think there's something to worry about. Yeah, so I mean, I think both worlds are possible. Like, I'm definitely not sort of, you know, making a personal prediction here, but I mean, I think it's definitely the case that the vast majority of experts think that AGI is AGI, like however defined, is possible in the next kind of like 2 to 10 years. Like it's a thing that's on the cards.
But I look at these threats and they don't even look to me like AGI. They're actually people using the technology. It's not the technology using the technology, it's us. Which makes me feel even a greater sense of doom than you saying AGI is 5 years away. It's just so much bad stuff can be done by people.
Yeah, and Greg, if I could just jump in there before you respond. I mean, it sounds from what you're saying and from what I've read about your work, so whether or not AGI is possible is perhaps not as relevant anyway. It's bad actors doing bad things with the tech, less about misaligned sort of AGI taking over. Is that a fair summary?
Yeah, I mean, I think both of those risks are on the table. Like obviously this misuse risk, like it's happening now, right? So I think it's very hard to be skeptical about this misuse risk. It's happening now, and it seems it's just going to get more acute. There's obviously more uncertainty about this AGI loss of control risk, but I think it's still, you know, really credible science around it, and it's something worth worrying about.
Very uplifting discussion. Any fun?
Like, you think about like nuclear capabilities. Like there are a lot of nuclear warheads lying around that no one's like no member of the public hasn't appropriated, right? Like there are barriers to doing that, but there is a country that dropped a nuclear bomb, killing hundreds of thousands of civilians, right? And you know that is also, I suppose, part. I think what should be the factor, like constraining the role of the state, is something to keep in mind. Like the capability is not just around everyday people creating a bioweapon. It's actually about governments creating bioweapons.
But the difference was now it's corporations building the nuclear weapons by analogy.
That's what I mean.
Like,
there's this very close nexus between the sophisticated technology industries and military capabilities, particularly in the United States. In fact, that's how a lot of the ambition is now framed, and the prohibition on regulation, on export and stuff. So it's also about empowering states to do terrible things to citizens or to people outside their borders, sometimes to citizens within their borders. Let's also be honest. And I think that's the other problem, like corporations aligning with states to do really destructive stuff. I mean, that's part of the history of technology as well.
Yeah, I mean, linking together a few of these stories, we did see news just this week that the Pentagon was keen to plug Grok directly into all of their military capabilities. So, you know, there's like definitely lots of ways that this is not going well.
Putin in a bikini.
Insane strategy.
Look, that's been a sobering. I feel more doomer than I've been in the past. I don't know about you guys, but I'm going back to Earthsea, book 5. I'm going to go to a happier place for the rest of the evening. Thanks for being part of it, everyone. Particularly Greg. Good luck, and we'll put some details with good ancestors in the show notes, so people that want to find out more about it can do so. And thanks as always, Dan and Lizzie, for your uplifting input into a discussion about the long-term future. Bye.
Thanks for having me on.
You've been listening to Burning Platforms. It was recorded on January 22 and produced on Naarm land by Rebecca Connell.
talk again soon.